The Galactic Military Academy's Sub-Level 7 hummed with the kind of nervous energy typically reserved for diplomatic incidents and cafeteria food poisoning outbreaks. Today, however, the tension centered around Testing Chamber Omega-9, a facility so legendarily impenetrable that most species considered it less an examination and more a cosmic joke, with a 40-minute punchline. Commander Vexthala, a 7-foot-tall Corthanian with skin like polished obsidian and an attitude to match, stood before the observation deck's reinforced viewing portal. Her 4 eyes tracked the readings on multiple holographic displays, while her secondary arms adjusted the environmental controls with practiced precision. 23 years of academy service had taught her many things, but primarily that overconfidence was the universe's favorite method of cosmic correction. "Remind me again why we're putting a Deathworlder through the Omega Protocol," she muttered, her voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd seen too many promising recruits become promising statistics. Lieutenant Crix, a diminutive Falarian, whose enthusiasm typically exceeded his common sense, practically vibrated with excitement. Because the Terran Diplomatic Corps specifically requested full integration protocols, something about proving human military compatibility and demonstrating peaceful intentions. He paused, consulting his datapad, though I noticed they didn't specify which human they were sending. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering that had taken 3 of the galaxy's most paranoid civilizations 4 years to design. Constructed from molecularly bonded tritanium alloy and lined with quantum dampening fields, it measured exactly 50 meters in each dimension, a cube of impossibility that had humbled the finest minds from 12-star systems. The walls incorporated adaptive camouflage technology that could shift between mirror-smooth surfaces and maze-like projections, while the floor contained pressure-sensitive tiles that would electrify, disappear, or occasionally play embarrassing childhood memories if stepped on incorrectly. The ceiling featured a particularly cruel touch, a slowly descending energy field that would render any occupant unconscious after exactly 40 minutes, ensuring that even the most persistent attempts would end in dignified failure rather than uncomfortable death. The designers had called it humane. The recruits had other names for it, most of which weren't suitable for diplomatic reports. 40 minutes, Vexthala repeated, reviewing the specifications for the 1,000th time. 40 minutes to navigate 17 distinct puzzle chambers, each requiring species-specific problem-solving techniques, while avoiding 14 different types of non-lethal but thoroughly unpleasant deterrents. She flexed her primary arms, a gesture that among her people indicated profound skepticism. The record holder, that brilliant young Zenthari genius, managed to reach Chamber 12 in 37 minutes before the sleep field activated. "Yes, sir," Crix replied, though his attention was focused on the betting pools displayed on his secondary screen. "Current odds have the human failing within the first 10 minutes. The maintenance crew is particularly confident. They're betting she won't make it past the rotation chamber." The human in question stood in the antechamber, undergoing final equipment checks with the kind of patient resignation typically associated with tax audits or family reunion. She appeared unremarkable by galactic standards. Standard biped configuration, single head, the usual complement of limbs arranged in conventional pattern. Her species designation read Terran, though the file contained an unusual number of warning symbols that the translation software seemed reluctant to explain. Zelix, the Academy's chief psychologist and a being whose confidence in his analytical abilities bordered on the religious, studied her through his observation instruments. "Fascinating specimen," he murmured, adjusting his spectral analyzer. "Notice the elevated heart rate, the slight tremor in the extremities, the dilated pupils. Classic pre-examination anxiety. Perfectly normal response to impossible circumstance." What he failed to mention, primarily because his instruments weren't designed to measure such things, was the way she kept glancing at the chamber's structural support beams, or how her fingers kept tracing calculations in the air, or the small, almost predatory smile that flickered across her features when she thought no one was looking. The testing chamber's central computer, a quantum-enhanced artificial intelligence that had been programmed with the accumulated tactical knowledge of 47 civilizations, ran its final diagnostics. Every sensor confirmed optimal functionality. Every barrier registered full integrity. Every puzzle chamber showed perfect calibration. "All systems nominal," the AI announced in its perfectly modulated voice. "Chamber sealed, atmospheric pressure stabilized. Quantum dampening fields at maximum efficiency. Estimated completion time for species designation Terra. The AI paused, processing thousands of variables through probability matrices that had been refined over centuries of testing. Probability of successful completion, 000. Now, the chamber's blast doors sealed with a sound like the universe clearing its throat. 40 minutes began counting down on displays throughout the observation deck. In the betting pools, credits changed hands as final wagers were played. Nobody, not even the maintenance crew, bet on 90 seconds. The human stood in the center of the chamber, completely still, apparently overwhelmed by the magnitude of her task. The observers nodded knowingly, another Deathworlder learning the hard way that brute force had no place in civilized problem-solving. They had absolutely no idea what they were about to witness. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the observers' expectations came exactly 12 seconds into the test, when the human did something that hadn't occurred to any previous candidate in the chamber's illustrious history of crushing dreams. She lay down on the floor. "What is she doing?" Lieutenant Crix whispered, his voice carrying the kind of horrified fascination typically reserved for watching someone attempt to pet a quantum singularity. Commander Vexthala's 4 eyes narrowed as she watched the human press her ear to the tritanium flooring. Either she's having some kind of psychological breakdown, or she paused, her secondary arms unconsciously reaching for her sidearm. "Computer, is she listening to something?" The AI's response carried a note of confusion that its programmers had specifically designed it never to experience. "Negative, Commander. No audio signals are being transmitted within the chamber. However, sensors indicate she is analyzing structural resonance patterns in the flooring." "She's what now?" Zelix leaned forward, his confidence in his psychological profile beginning to develop hairline fractures. That's not how you solve spatial puzzles. You're supposed to engage with the holographic interfaces, decode the symbolic representation, demonstrate cognitive flexibility through methodical. His explanation was interrupted by the human suddenly standing up, brushing dust off her uniform, and walking directly to the chamber's northeastern corner, not toward the obvious puzzle interface that glowed invitingly in the center of the room, not toward the clearly marked "Begin Here" sign that had been translated into 47 languages. Instead, she approached what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary section of wall and began running her hands along its surface like she was searching for something. "She's completely ignoring the first puzzle," Crix observed, his voice climbing an octave. "The rotation chamber sequence requires precise timing and spatial reasoning skills. She's supposed to activate the holographic matrix and, oh, for the love of cosmic entropy," Vexthala muttered, watching the human produce what appeared to be a small tool from her equipment belt. "Is she trying to break through the wall?" The answer came in the form of a soft clicking sound, followed by a section of the supposedly impenetrable tritanium panel sliding aside to reveal a maintenance access hatch that, according to the official blueprints, absolutely did not exist. "Computer," Vexthala said slowly, "explain to me how she found a maintenance hatch that isn't on any of our schematics." "Unknown, Commander. Cross-referencing construction records, discrepancy detect." The hatch was installed during the facility's construction but was classified as non-essential and omitted from standard blueprints. It provides access to the chamber's primary support infrastructure. The human disappeared through the hatch with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this sort of thing before. Which, if anyone had bothered to read the classified sections of her personnel file, they would have discovered she absolutely had. "She's in the support infrastructure," Zelix said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone watching his professional reputation dissolve in real time. "She's bypassed 17 puzzle chambers by crawling through maintenance tunnels." "That's not possible," Crix protested, pulling up holographic displays of the chamber's internal structure. "The support infrastructure is completely isolated from the testing area. There's no way to access the exit from—" His sentence was cut short by the sound of metal being forcibly rearranged somewhere within the chamber's wall. It was the kind of sound that made structural engineers wake up in cold sweats. A grinding, tearing noise that suggested something very expensive was being used for purposes its designers had never intended. "Computer, report," Vexthala snapped, her primary arms now definitely reaching for her weapon. "Minor structural damage detected in support beam gamma. Recommend immediate." The AI's recommendation was interrupted by another sound. this one resembling a fusion torch cutting through reinforced metal, which, as it turned out, was exactly what it was. "She's cutting through the support beams," Vexthala said, her voice carefully controlled in the way that preceded either profound enlightenment or total psychological collapse. "She's cutting through the load-bearing supports of a military-grade testing facility." "But what?" Crix asked, though his question was answered by the sudden appearance of sparks showering from the chamber's ceiling. What could she possibly hope to accomplish by the lights went out? Emergency illumination kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing the observation deck in the kind of red lighting that universally meant something has gone horribly wrong. The chamber's main display showed a cascade of system failures as backup power rerouted through increasingly creative pathways. "She's in the primary power conduit," the AI reported, its voice now carrying distinct notes of what could only be described as electronic panic. "Structural integrity compromised. Quantum dampening fields at 60% efficiency and fall. Recommend immediate evacuation of testing personnel." Through the observation portal they could see the human emerging from another access hatch, this one located behind the chamber's main exit door. She was covered in what appeared to be coolant fluid and carrying a piece of equipment that was definitely not standard issue. "Is that a plasma cutter?" Vexthala asked, though she already knew the answer. "According to sensors, yes," the AI replied. "A military-grade plasma cutter, which, according to regulations, should not be accessible to testing candidates." "Then where did she get it?" "She appears to have constructed it from components salvaged from the chamber's own system." The human was now doing something to the exit door that involved a great deal of sparks and a concerning amount of what looked like improvised explosive. The betting pools had gone completely silent, not because the outcome was no longer in doubt, but because nobody had thought to establish odds on candidate demolishes testing facility. "Computer," Vexthala said, her voice now carrying the tone of someone who had accepted that the universe was fundamentally unreasonable. "How long has she been in the chamber?" 87 seconds, Commander." "And how long until the sleep field active?" 38 minutes, 53 seconds. "However, the sleep field generator is currently offline due to power rerouting necessitated by structural damage to the primary." The AI's explanation was interrupted by an explosion that rattled the observation deck's reinforced windows and sent several junior officers diving for cover. When the smoke cleared, there was a perfectly human-sized hole in the chamber's exit wall and the human was gone. "She's escaped," Dr. Zellick said, his voice carrying the kind of wonder typically reserved for witnessing the birth of stars or the death of theoretical frameworks. "She's actually escaped. In 90 seconds, Crix added, consulting his chronometer with the mechanical precision of someone whose worldview had just been fed through an industrial shredder. From somewhere in the facility's depths came the sound of additional explosions, followed by the distinctive whine of structural supports recognizing that their services were no longer required. "Commander," the AI said, its voice now carrying unmistakable urgency, "recommend immediate evacuation of sublevel 7. Structural integrity has been compromised beyond acceptable parameters." Vexthala stared at the hole in the wall, then at her instruments, then at the hole again. "Computer, for the record, how exactly did she escape?" "By destroying the chamber, Commander. And that's allowed." "The regulations," the AI replied after a pause that suggested it was consulting legal databases across multiple star systems, "do not specifically prohibit the complete demolition of the testing facility as a solution method." What happened next would later be studied by military tacticians, structural engineers and philosophers across the galaxy, though none of them would ever quite agree on whether it represented the pinnacle of creative problem-solving or the most expensive temper tantrum in recorded history. The human, having successfully liberated herself from the confines of Chamber Omega-9, stood in the corridor outside the testing facility with the casual air of someone who had just completed a mildly interesting crossword puzzle. The plasma cutter she'd improvised from the chamber's own components hung from her belt like a metallic trophy, still glowing faintly with residual heat. Her uniform bore scorch marks, coolant stains, and what appeared to be the fossilized remains of someone's lunch from the previous century. But her expression suggested she was primarily concerned with whether the Academy cafeteria was still serving those little sandwiches she'd seen earlier. "Status report," Commander Vexthala demanded, her voice carrying the kind of controlled hysteria that preceded either battlefield promotions or court-martial proceeding. "Candidate has exited the testing chamber through unauthorized means," the AI reported, its tone suggesting it was still processing the philosophical implications of what had just occurred. Time elapsed, 91 seconds. Method of escape: structural demolition. Collateral damage: extensive. The word extensive proved to be what scholars would later classify as a significant understatement. The human's journey through the facility's support infrastructure had been less a careful navigation and more a controlled demolition project. She had identified the chamber's 3 primary load-bearing supports, calculated the precise amount of damage needed to compromise structural integrity without causing immediate collapse, and then executed a plan that would have impressed combat engineers and horrified safety inspectors in equal measure. She turned the entire chamber into a puzzle, Zelek said, his voice carrying the kind of awe typically reserved for witnessing supernovas or particularly spectacular traffic accidents. Instead of solving the puzzles inside the chamber, she made the chamber itself the puzzle. Through the observation portal, they could see the human examining the hole she'd created in the wall with the critical eye of someone evaluating their own handiwork. She reached into the gap, pulled out a chunk of titanium alloy, and held it up to the light as if checking its molecular composition. Apparently satisfied, she pocketed the fragment and began walking toward the exit. "Computer," Vexthala said, her secondary arms now actively gesturing in patterns that among her people indicated impending nervous breakdown. "Explain to me how she knew exactly where to cut to compromise the chamber's structural integrity." Analysis of her cutting pattern suggests advanced knowledge of load distribution theory, structural engineering principles, and applied physics, the AI replied. Additionally, she appears to have calculated the precise resonance frequency of the titanium alloy and used harmonic vibration to weaken the molecular bonds before applying direct cutting force. "She did what to the molecular bonds?" She hummed at them, command. The implications of this statement were still settling into the observers' minds when the facility's emergency systems began broadcasting a message that would later be remembered as the most understated warning in galactic military history. "Attention all personnel. Minor structural instability detected in testing wing 7. Please proceed to designated safety areas in an orderly fashion." The human, meanwhile, had reached the corridor's main junction and was consulting what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. Not a map of the testing facility which would have been provided in her briefing materials, but rather a detailed schematic of the entire Academy's underground infrastructure, complete with annotations in what looked suspiciously like her own handwriting. "Where did she get that map?" Crix asked, though his question was answered by the growing realization that the human had never intended to solve the chamber's puzzles through conventional means. The map, the plasma cutter components, the knowledge of structural engineering, all of it suggested a level of preparation that went far beyond what was typical for Academy candidates. "She planned this," Vexthala said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had just discovered that their supposedly foolproof system had been outfoxed by someone who treated military-grade security as a mild inconvenience. She knew exactly what she was going to do before she set foot in that chamber. The human was now approaching the facility's main exit, having navigated the underground corridors with the confidence of someone who had memorized every twist and turn. Behind her, the testing wing was experiencing what the emergency systems euphemistically described as cascading structural readjustment, which translated roughly to the building is falling down in slow motion. "Evacuation protocols are now in effect," the AI announced, its voice carrying the kind of calm professionalism that suggested it had been programmed to remain composed even while the universe was actively trying to disassemble itself. "All personnel are advised to exit testing wing 7 immediately." Through the observation deck's reinforced windows, they could see other Academy staff members streaming out of the building with the urgent but dignified pace of people who had been trained to handle emergencies but had never expected to handle this particular type of emergency. The human walked among them with the casual gait of someone who had just completed a routine training exercise, occasionally nodding politely to instructors who stared at her with the kind of expression typically reserved for natural disasters or tax audit. "She's not even running," Crix observed, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been admiration if it hadn't been so thoroughly mixed with horror. "The building is collapsing behind her and she's walking." "Because she knows exactly how long it will take to collapse," Vexthala replied, watching the human pause to examine a decorative plant in the corridor. "She calculated the structural failure rate. She knows she has time. As if to prove this point, the human stopped at a water fountain, took a drink and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand before continuing toward the exit. The gesture was so perfectly mundane, so completely at odds with the chaos unfolding behind her, that it transcended comedy and entered the realm of cosmic absurdity. Final time, the AI announced as the human stepped through the facility's main exit into the afternoon sunlight of the Academy's central courtyard. 91.7 seconds. The explosion that followed was not particularly large by military standards, but it was precisely calculated to complete the structural failure she had initiated. The testing wing folded in on itself with the kind of mathematical precision that suggested someone had run the numbers and determined exactly how much building needed to fall down to ensure complete system failure without endangering adjacent structure. The human stood in the courtyard, brushing dust from her uniform, and looked back at the collapsing building with the expression of someone who had just finished a particularly satisfying home improvement project. Then she checked her chronometer, nodded to herself and began walking toward the Academy's main administrative building, presumably to report for her next assignment. "She's going to file her completion report," Zelix said, his voice carrying the kind of hollow amazement that suggested his faith in standardized testing had just been forcibly restructured. "She's going to walk into the administrative office and report that she successfully completed the Omega protocol." "In 91 seconds, Crix added, consulting his instruments with the mechanical precision of someone whose reality had just been handed a rather thorough renovation. "By destroying the test," Vexthala concluded, watching the human disappear into the administrative building with the same casual confidence she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that typically precedes either enlightenment or apocalypse. In the Academy's emergency command center, hastily established in a conference room that still smelled faintly of yesterday's diplomatic lunch, the gathered officials stared at their instruments with the expression of people who had just discovered that their understanding of physics was more of a gentle suggestion than an absolute law. Admiral Corinth, the Academy's commanding officer and a being whose confidence in military protocol had previously been considered unshakable, stood before a holographic display showing the structural remains of Testing Wing 7. The display was mostly empty space with a few optimistic dots representing pieces of debris large enough to register on sensors. "Let me ensure I understand the situation correctly," the Admiral said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who suspected the universe was playing an elaborate practical joke. "A single human candidate, given 40 minutes to complete our most challenging examination, instead chose to demolish the entire testing facility in under 2 minutes. 91.7 seconds, Zelix corrected, consulting his chronometer with the obsessive precision of someone whose entire professional identity had just been fed through a quantum processor. "And technically she didn't demolish the entire facility. She calculated the minimum structural damage required to compromise the chamber's integrity while ensuring controlled collapse that wouldn't endanger adjacent building." "Oh well, that makes it perfectly reasonable then," Admiral Corinth replied, her sarcasm so dense it could have been used as armor plating. "I feel much better knowing that our testing facility was destroyed by someone who was being careful about it." Commander Vexthala, who had spent the last hour reviewing sensor data in an increasingly desperate attempt to understand what had happened, looked up from her displays with the expression of someone who had just discovered that mathematics was apparently more of a hobby than a science. "Sir, I've analyzed her methodology. She didn't just destroy the chamber randomly. She turned the entire facility into a three-dimensional puzzle and solved it by identifying the single point of failure that would create the most efficient escape route. She weaponized architecture," Lieutenant Crix added, his voice carrying a note of something that was either terror or admiration. "She looked at a military-grade testing facility and thought, I wonder how this would look as a pile of rubble." The human in question was currently seated in Administrative Office 7B, filling out paperwork with the kind of methodical attention to detail that suggested this was the most challenging part of her entire day. According to the surveillance feeds, she had correctly identified every form required for test completion, properly documented her time and method, and was now working on what appeared to be a maintenance request for the plasma cutter she'd improvised. "She's filing for reimbursement," Admiral Corinth observed, watching the human carefully complete a form labeled Equipment Requisition, Improvised Tools. "She's requesting compensation for the components she used to build a fusion torch from our own security system. The regulations are quite clear on this point," The Academy's legal advisor, Counselor Thex, interjected with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he'd found his calling in the intersection of military law and cosmic absurdity. Any equipment constructed by candidates during testing becomes Academy property. But candidates are entitled to compensation for materials used in successful completion of assigned tasks. Successful completion, Zelek sputtered, his secondary limbs gesturing in patterns that among his people indicated profound philosophical distress. She destroyed the test. She completed the test, Counselor Thex corrected, consulting his legal database with the satisfaction of someone who had found a loophole large enough to pilot a battleship through. The Omega Protocol requires candidates to exit the testing chamber within 40 minutes. She exited in 91 seconds. The method of exit is not specified in the regulations. Admiral Corinth stared at the legal advisor with the expression of someone who had just discovered that the universe had a sense of humor and it was apparently quite vindictive. Are you telling me that because our regulations don't specifically prohibit destroying the testing facility, her method is legally valid? Not just legally valid, Counselor Thex replied, his voice carrying the kind of glee that suggested he was already composing law review articles about this case. Technically, she set a new Academy record, by a margin of approximately 38 minutes. The implications of this statement settled over the command center like a particularly aggressive form of cosmic radiation. Somewhere in the galaxy, other military academies were going to hear about this. Recruitment offices were going to ask questions. Defense contractors were going to want to know how someone had turned their impenetrable testing facility into a construction project. Computer, Admiral Corinth said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had accepted that reality was more of a flexible concept than a fixed constant. Please compile a report on this incident for transmission to Galactic Command. Report compiled, the AI replied immediately, suggesting it had been working on this document since the moment the human had first laid down on the chamber floor. Summary: human candidate successfully completed Omega Protocol through application of creative problem-solving methodologies not previously considered by Academy designer. Recommendation: immediate revision of all testing protocols to account for species-specific approaches to obstacle navigation. Species-specific approaches, Commander Vex Thala repeated, her voice carrying the kind of hollow amazement that suggested she was still processing the events of the last hour. You mean we need to redesign our tests because humans think differently? We need to redesign our tests because humans think destructively, Dr. Zelek corrected, reviewing his psychological profiles with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of behavioral analysis had just been subjected to percussive maintenance. They don't solve problems, they eliminate them. In Administrative Office 7B, the human had finished her paperwork and was now reading what appeared to be a recruitment brochure for the Academy's Special Operations Division. According to the surveillance feeds, she had circled several courses that other species considered suicide missions, and was making notes in the margins that looked suspiciously like tactical improvement. She's applying for advanced combat training, Admiral Corinth observed, watching the human complete another form with the casual efficiency of someone who considered bureaucracy a minor obstacle rather than a way of life. She's requesting assignment to the most dangerous missions in our catalog. According to her psychological profile, Dr. Zelek said, consulting his instruments with the careful attention of someone who no longer trusted his own expertise. She considers our most dangerous missions to be moderately interesting challenges. Her exact words, apparently, were finally, something that might keep me awake. She's been bored, Commander Vex Thala realized, her voice carrying the kind of horrified understanding that typically preceded either breakthrough insights or complete mental collapse. This entire time, she's been bored. The most challenging test in our Academy's history, and she's been bored. The human stood up from her desk, gathered her completed paperwork, and walked toward the administrative office's exit, with the same casual confidence she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. As she passed the surveillance camera, she looked directly into the lens and offered a small smile that somehow managed to be both reassuring and deeply unsettling. She knows we're watching, Lieutenant Crix observed, his voice carrying a note of something that was definitely not comforting. She's always known we're watching, Admiral Corinth replied, studying the human's file with the expression of someone who had just discovered that their supposedly comprehensive background checks had missed a few rather significant details. The question is, what else does she know that we don't? The answer, as it turned out, was quite a lot. But that was a problem for tomorrow's administrators to solve. Today's problem was figuring out how to explain to Galactic Command that their most secure testing facility had been converted into a learning experience by a single human, who considered their greatest challenge to be a mild inconvenience. In the end, they settled on a report that emphasized the human's innovative approach to problem solving, and her unique perspective on traditional methodology. It was, they felt, a much more diplomatic way of saying that she had looked at their impossible test and decided it needed more explosions. The galaxy, as it turned out, was not ready for human pragmatism, but it was about to get a comprehensive education in the subject, whether it wanted one or not.